Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the doctoral presentation of Blake Skidmore. Blake is a doctoral candidate in the Doctor of Social Work program at the University of Louisville, Kent School of Social Work and Family Science. For those of you who are joining us as guests, after Blake has finished his presentation, we will be excusing you from the meeting room. And at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Blake to conduct his presentation.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Collins-Camargo. First, forgive me, I'll be looking down a lot. I was having some technical problems with having my script up here. So thank you, Dr. Collins-Camargo, and thank you everyone for being here. To begin, there are many faculty members I'd like to thank who have supported my doctoral journey, particularly Drs. Fry, Harris, and Winters. Thank you also to my chair, Dr. Collins-Camargo, and the other committee members, Drs. Mathis, Rima, and B. Special thanks to Dr. Emma Starrett-Hong and Dr. Trinidad Jackson, my content experts. Your support, feedback, and expertise were essential in this project. Thank you to friends and family for your support these last 3 years. It made completing the program possible. A special thank you to my wife, Jillian, my daughter, Mari, and our soon-to-arrive son. You have been incredibly supportive and sacrificed a lot for me. I love you very much. Lastly, thank you to the 8 individuals who participated in this study. If anything meaningful comes from it, it will be because of your openness and insights. As mentioned, my name is Blake Skidmore. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a researcher within the Kent School. I completed my undergraduate and master's degree at The Ohio State University. I spent my career doing counseling and managing research projects. Regarding this study, it covers complex and difficult topics, and I have a lot to cover very quickly, so forgive my brevity and lack of nuance. I also want to acknowledge that I approach this study aware that I am a person with many privileges, and as a white person, I benefit from the systems that harm and oppress people of color. While I continue the work to grow in my awareness, I know my research is shaped by my experiences. I am also a member of the organization from which study participants were recruited, so being mindful of power dynamics and potential bias in this work is important. Now on to the study. Interesting, it's not advancing. There we go. White supremacy and racism persist in the United States at structural and interpersonal levels. White supremacy is the ideology and violent system that resources and privileges white people through the exploitation and oppression of people of color. According to Harmon and Tavernese, the year 2020 represented a peak in support among white people towards racial justice efforts and to dismantle white supremacy. This heightened awareness and engagement was spurred on by tragedies like George Floyd's murder by police. His death specifically played a pivotal role and ignited protests across the country, led by BIPOC activists. According to multiple polls, the demonstrations were multiracial with millions of participants and high percentages of white identifying protesters. However, according to Pew Research, since that time, support from white people has waned significantly. And while there is important debate over the role white individuals should play in racial justice work, this paper was written with the supposition that they should be engaged directly in support of BIPOC-led efforts. Research shows that white anti-racism, which is opposing racist policies through actions or expressed ideas, matters for several reasons. Systemic change requires large-scale collective action. Support of white people increases the impact of BIPOC-led efforts. White people have significant influence and resources, and throughout history, BIPOC justice leaders have called on white people to join in the struggle. Thus, despite the challenges their involvement brings, more white people engaged in racial justice work is essential. Which brings us to the purpose of this study. Research has begun to identify ambivalence within white people who value racial justice action. Ambivalence is simultaneous and contradictory attitudes or feelings towards something. However, as Aptheker notes, subsets of white people have engaged in anti-racism for generations. Understanding their journey to activism is important. Research has examined how white individuals develop positive racial identities and what propels some white people to move from passivity to racial justice activism. However, Yet to be fully explored is the role that ambivalence plays in these processes and how ambivalence is navigated by some and not others. Thus, this exploratory study seeks to develop a deeper understanding of white racial justice organizers' experiences with ambivalence and how they navigate it. By deepening our understanding, this study hopes to offer lessons learned and to contribute to our knowledge of how to initiate and sustain white racial justice activism. Note the specific parameters. This paper seeks to understand the experiences of white people who A, have a belief that racism is a problem, B, believe they should act to help end racism and white supremacy, and C, have experienced ambivalence in their effort to take action. Research has explored several relevant topics: defining racial ambivalence, expressions of white racial ambivalence, and how white people move from passivity to activism. First, defining racial ambivalence, multiple studies offered definitions. Here is one: simultaneously holding a desire to defend white privilege, a desire to act justly in society, and a fear of being attacked for those actions by white systems of power. Regarding expressions of racial justice ambivalence, the literature offers many examples. Here are a few: defensiveness when confronted with new awareness, avoiding the realities of racism, and perhaps most pertinent, white people experiencing uncertainty, shame, discomfort, and fear when attempting to behave in ways that align with their developing awareness. Each study also found these experiences, ambivalence, contradiction, and distress, served as barriers or inhibitors to white people taking action or furthering their development of a positive racial identity. Regarding what propels white people from passivity to action, the literature revealed that awareness is insufficient. Instead, it is a developmental process that engages what Mark Warren termed the head, heart, and hand. The head represents deepening awareness and knowledge. The heart represents engaging deeply held values and emotions. The hand represents taking part in action. These processes were supported by factors like morals and values, seminal experiences, and relationships with people of color. But what remains unanswered in the literature is an examination of ambivalence throughout these processes. Which brings me to my research questions. 1, in what ways do white identifying racial justice organizers experience ambivalence? 2, if ambivalence is experienced, how do they respond? Several sensitizing theories helped inform my attempts to answer these questions, including critical theory and critical consciousness, white racial identity development, and humanistic theory. Regarding methods, this study utilized a cross-sectional mixed methodological approach with an emphasis on qualitative methods. 8 participants were recruited. Each was a white identifying racial justice organizer engaged with a national multiracial organization focused on bringing white people into racial and economic justice. Purposive and snowball sampling methods were used to garner a diverse sample. Some respondents were staff with the organization, while most were volunteers. Participants completed 2 validated measures: the short critical consciousness scale and the anti-racism behavioral inventory. Collectively, these examine respondents' critical reflection, critical motivation, critical action, as well as anti-racism awareness and behavior. Participants then provided demographic information, including years in racial justice, state where they reside, age, gender identity, level of education, and how they identify politically. Last, they completed a 60-minute qualitative interview examining racial justice beliefs, behaviors, and experiences with ambivalence. Descriptive statistics were used to understand quantitative data, while thematic analysis was used with qualitative data, wherein themes were identified through iterative coding, which is basically grouping and synthesizing themes or meaning from what participants share. The table on the left contains the demographic data. The table on the right contains summary survey scores, as well as some example questions from the surveys. You can see the demographic data has some variance in age group, gender identity, and education level. Notably, 80%, almost 80% of participants had 6 or more years involved with racial justice work. Additionally, most respondents identified as leftists compared to liberals or other sociopolitical categories. Regarding the surveys, respondent scores across the board were high, with mean scores of 0.8 or higher in 5 of 7 categories. Simply put, this indicates high levels of critical consciousness and engagement in racial justice work. In this study, this data serves less to examine respondents' beliefs and more as confirmation of their high involvement in racial justice work. Here is a figure representing the key themes identified from the qualitative data. These 8 themes help paint a picture of participants' experiences navigating ambivalence and suggest initial answers to the research questions. They are grouped into 3 categories. First, in the middle are the mediating and moderating factors, values-driven work, and white supremacy culture. Participants described how their relationship to these 2 themes helped explain their experiences of ambivalence or motivation when examining the other themes. Values-driven work served to decrease the influence of ambivalence, while white supremacy culture exacerbated it. Next, on the left are individual processes: internal work, growing skills and knowledge, and showing up. These themes describe choices, behaviors, practices, or experience that can generally be undertaken alone and serve to develop the person's beliefs, skills, or experiences that they saw as pivotal in navigating ambivalence and sustaining activism. Last, on the right, are the social processes. These are BIPOC voices, creating connection, and my role in the movement. They describe choices, behaviors, practices, or experiences undertaken in the context of relationship, community, or participation in collective effort. They serve to establish connection, accountability, and mentorship pivotal to navigating ambivalence. It's important to note that participants describe their experiences with all of these themes as interconnected, complex, and nonlinear. Now I will dive a little more deeply into each theme. First, ambivalence. Respondents confirmed their experiences with ambivalence throughout their journeys. Examples included disorientation with increased awareness, fear of taking risks, navigating their own whiteness in multiracial spaces, and balancing other obligations, time, or material interests. Respondents explained that experience of ambivalence created urges to pull away, avoid, or disengage racial justice work. When talking about ambivalence, Kate, which is a pseudonym, shared, "What does it cost you to take a different look at your family, at your country, at where you're from? What does it cost you spiritually to really reckon with what people you love have done? What does it cost you spiritually to reckon with things that I have done?" Next are the mediating and moderating factors. These themes, values-driven work and its sub-themes, personal values, organizational values, creating a culture, describe how deeply held beliefs about life or how the world should be played a crucial role in participants' journeys and the formation of community. Organizational values, sub-themes were personal values, which is self-explanatory. Organizational values, which are the established values and principles claimed by the racial justice organization. And lastly, creating culture, which emerged from engaging in values-driven work in the context of the community. Tim, when talking about organizational values, apologies for the typo, that was a last-minute edit. Through those values, a community is formed. It allows room to deal with things like our perfectionism. Next is white supremacy culture, with sub-themes of enacting white supremacy and shame. Here, participants describe the ways that overt and covert beliefs they still possess about whiteness and white culture impact their racial justice work. Examples included perfectionism, power hoarding, individualism, sense of urgency, and self-righteousness. Participants described these traits as having a corrosive effect on their engagement and the health of the racial justice organizing community. Kate, when talking about shame, shared, "You can maybe get somebody to do something once based on a feeling of shame and urgency, but that's not how you build a healthy, sustained movement." Next are the individual processes. As noted, these are the themes described as at the individual level. Internal work included self-examination, coping with discomfort, and self-care. Next is growing skills and knowledge. And last is showing up with the sub-themes of accepting invitations and critical events. Tim, when talking about internal work, shared, to grow, we have to stretch, and stretching is not always comfortable. Arrow, when speaking on self-examination, shared, I have slowly tried to unlearn those messages about race, and I challenge my unexamined feelings slowly but surely. Heidi, on accepting invitations, shared, people made me feel like I had something to bring. Polly, on critical events, shared, seeing the sheer amount of people that we have power, that was definitely pivotal. Lastly are the social processes, which again are themes in the context of relationship, community, or participation in collective effort. They are BIPOC voices, creating connection, which has several sub-themes like mentorship and relationship with people of color. And lastly, my role in the movement, which describes participants' growing understanding of how they fit and contribute to a larger movement. In talking about BIPOC voices, I cannot see it because of where you all are, but I'll just read, we do not have the answers. We need to listen to the leaders of the oppressed, then use our power and influence to help make that happen. Tim, on commitment and accountability, shared, it is a responsibility, if you're aware, to act. I could not be a person I would be comfortable waking up to and looking in the mirror if I was not contributing to justice beyond my own self. Peggy, on small tasks, shared, I can't change it all, but I can do what's in my world to do. That doesn't mean my work is insignificant. In summary, the study's 9 themes are complex and none exists in isolation. They speak to one another and create a synergy or amplification effect, which respondents experienced as part of a racial justice community or milieu, specifically the racial justice organization they are a part of. The presence of ambivalence on their journey was evident, but values-driven work, individual effort, and social connections played critical roles in their ability to navigate it. Moving on to the discussion. First, the findings from this study are consistent with past research on ambivalence, including its manifestations. While the current study suggests a broader definition should be adopted when considering barriers to racial justice action. The findings also support previous literature on white people's movement from passivity to action, but adds to our understanding of navigating barriers faced along the journey. The study makes a handful of contributions. First, broadening our conceptualization of ambivalence to include things like material interests, lack of time, social anxieties, etc. Next, that ambivalence is ongoing and never conclusively resolved, but can be integrated and accepted in the journey. Next, that shame is the internal voice casting doubt on the worthiness or purposefulness of white anti-racist effort, and that actions motivated by guilt and shame are unsustainable. Lastly, working alongside other people who share your racial justice values is essential. Regarding limitations, there are numerous limitations. This was a small sample with a highly engaged racial justice organizers from one organization within one community, which limits our understanding of variances in experience. Numerous context-specific factors shaped participants' responses. The study was conducted by a sole researcher with technical support and oversight from my chair, but lacked diverse perspectives. The research cannot account for potential differences based on participants' years in racial justice, age group, gender or sexual identities, education level, or other demographics. We cannot rule out the influence of bias based on these factors, particularly my engagement with the organization and personal commitment to racial justice. There are numerous implications. I'll just read some highlighted ones. There's implications for racial justice organizations, white people on the journey, the field of social work, and future research. For racial justice organizations, I think normalizing and engaging ambivalence is the key implication. For white people on the journey, showing up, connecting, investing in relationships is essential. Anticipate discomfort and ambivalence, but also purpose and growth. For the field of social work, focus on values-driven action, not just personal growth. For future research, examine the positive impact of the racial justice milieu and explore innovative methods to engage ambivalence directly. So in conclusion, lasting systemic change will require sustained action among white people. Awareness of racism or critical consciousness is insufficient to generate action. The present study described white identifying racial justice organizers' experiences of ambivalence and the processes that help them navigate it. Among the most significant factors were values-driven work and white supremacy culture. In addition, participants described individual and social processes that help sustain racial justice activism. This study provides a more nuanced look at the impact of ambivalence on white anti-racist action than has been offered in the literature to date. Future research examining the role of white people in racial justice work must account for these complex and contradictory experiences and the factors and processes that mitigate or exacerbate the impact of ambivalence on the movement to activism. Here are my references. And that is it. I really appreciate everyone being here.
This concludes the capstone presentation of Blake Skidmore. We appreciate all of our guests attending and supporting Blake today. We are now going to be closing the meeting and asking the guests to leave so we can move forward. Please enjoy your day.